This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, now we're recording. All right. So some people's timetable has changed hours. Could you just raise your hand if your timetable, the time has changed? Like 10% of you, 7 or 8%. So most people's time is the same, but the room has changed. Are all of you those of you who whose time and room has changed, or times, are you all Peretz students? Any other students from anybody else's tutorials whose time has changed? Who's your tutor? Okay, that's good, that's fine. Okay, so it sounds to me like it's only Peret's tutorial, and Peret is able to teach you at 2:15 or 3:15, right? Is it 2 or 3 or 2? It's changed to 3, but it's normally 2 o'clock? Yes, 2:15. So it's normally 2:15 and it's changed to 3:15. So what might happen is, what I'm worried about is that your schedules, you have other things to do at 3:15. So who has an opinion on the timing of the tutorial? Would you rather it stay at 2:15? All right, so here's what we'll do. Plan to meet at the original room. Plan to meet at the room that okay. It's not straightforward. We're working this out on the fly. Okay, so the problem, where does the tutorial normally meet at 2:15? Where? John, Medley, do you know the number? 205? West 605. B 605? 605? You're a visual person, aren't you? You saw us. You read a 6 as a G. Oh, it's ground. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's where it normally is. Okay, and there's like the freaky week. And where is it meeting today?
MSD 138.
Okay, so most people in this tutorial are going to be expecting to show up to MSD 138. Okay, so why don't we do this? Shall we have it meet at MSD 138 at 2:15, at the normal time, but the new room? If the room is not available, Peret will take you out somewhere. You will find another space. Maybe the atrium, maybe a cafe. If that's the case, we'll just buy everybody a coffee and reimburse you. Okay, find a way to have. Does everybody have their 2 computers? Is anybody going to need a computer for the tutorial? We're doing table builder.
If normally there is a topical thinking in this pod, because there has been 2 times a lot of people saying that they have actually finished there as well. So I think this might be the case rather than
Okay. Take them to a computer lab. Find somewhere else. I will do my best. What's the lab at the back? You know, the southwest corner of the building on the 2nd floor. You know that computer lab all the way at the back? We go there. Normally there's not a class in there. And if the worst comes to worst, seriously, just go out to a cafe, but just find somewhere to have your meeting if the room is not available. So I'm sorry about that. It fell off my radar. So you're meeting at your normal tutorial time at MSD 138. Do you guys, if you've got any friends who are in that tutorial, could you text them and let them know that it's 2:15 at 138 and going from there? And we'll also try to send an email, to the class. Thank you. Sorry about that. Not ideal, but every once in a while these little hiccups happen on a busy campus. Okay. Rob from the MUPS has an announcement about debate. Do you want to use the microphone?
I suppose I probably should. Thank you. Hi, I'm the MUPS debate officer for this year, and so I'm just sort of here to spruik our first debate night next week, Thursday at the Clyde Hotel, upstairs, if you're coming and along looking for us. So sort of starting at 6:30 and aiming to get the topic announced at 7, so that'll be when things kick off. You don't have to have any experience. In fact, it's probably better if you don't have any experience. It's an opportunity to just come along and discuss some current urban issues that are of interest, and it's a bit of a chance to practice some public speaking skills in a non-accessible, no-stress arena. Socialise with people outside of tutorials. And I mean, I think probably the biggest draw card is that there's free bar snacks and drinks. So please come along and make me feel like I've got some sort of company there, because I don't want to be sitting in a room by myself. And the event's on the Facebook page if you just search for MUPS on Facebook, and don't go to the Physiotherapy Students Society, but make sure it's the planning one. So hopefully I see you all next week.
What is a bassinet? Did you say free bassinet?
Bar snacks.
Bar snacks. Sorry.
But a bassinet would be with baby snacks.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I was like, maybe they mean something different here. I got really excited about that. I was like, oh, maybe it's full of food. Meat. A meat tray. That's what would be in the bassinet in Australia. It would be raw meat. One time I won a meat tray at a pub. I was like, what am I supposed to do with this? They were like, take it home and cook it. I was like, oh, but I'm at a pub and I want some cooked meat. Anyway. Apparently, they do these surveys where they ask people to rate their fear of things, and they say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how afraid are you of snakes? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how afraid are you of public speaking? And then on a scale of 1 to 10, how afraid are you of dying? And they find that people rate themselves to be more afraid of public speaking than dying. So these, the debate nights and that sort of thing, if you're like immediately seized by a fear, you're not irrational. Public speaking is really hard for people. So, but it is also a really good time to start working on that, because the better you get at it, the better edge you have over other people who haven't worked on it. It's natural for almost no one. So, just remember when you're thinking about going or not going, curling up in bed, that you might be having that kind of response to it. Okay, so what I want to do today is talk about the census data. And also talk about how we do deflation and how we adjust monetary values for time. But first, I just wanted to give you a little bit of feedback. We've started marking your papers. So far, so good. They're interesting. I'm getting a lot of cool, interesting ideas, a lot of fresh stuff that people haven't come up with before. So it's really nice. You're a bit of a creative group. Although, as I've said before, fresh and creative is not necessarily the path to an H1 on this assignment. Now, it's not bad to be fresh and creative. It's just if you're doing something kind of boring and mundane, but you're doing it well, that still can be an H1. So if you don't feel like yours is fresh and creative, don't worry. That's not a marking criteria. You might have to sort of settle into fresh and creative later. But a couple of things are coming up that are worth mentioning. So the pet peeves. So the first two, I'm seeing this language popping up in the research question, and in the language of the methodology statement that can something da 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 da, should something da 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 da. The answer is yes, anything can happen. That's not a research question. Research, we observe the past, to look forward to the future. So if your research question has can in it, we've taken a position for marking where we haven't failed people for this, but you might end up with a lower mark than you'd like. In this assignment, in assignment 1, you probably won't fail over a perfectly executed methodology, a problem statement with a can in it, otherwise perfectly executed with a can. But you will fail the final paper if can appears in your research question. So just don't do that. It's not universal. I think most people have gotten the message, but a couple people have used it. So just be a little careful. That's hypothetical. You know, lots of things can happen, but lots of things don't happen. So we can't research what could happen. We can think about that's the realm of philosophy. We can think about what could happen. What are the range of possibilities? We can create hypotheses around what could happen, but we cannot research what could happen because there's only one reality so far. Well, we haven't discovered how to access the other realities aside from through math, and that's all very hypothetical at the moment. And maybe in a generation we'll all be, living the alternate, be able to access the alternate realities that the math suggests are out there. But for now, we can't. Prove is another one we cannot prove. We can get close to the language of proof, but we almost never use prove in the social sciences. So just be really, really careful that you're not invoking this idea of proof. Or science. We're not doing science either, unless you are doing science. If you're doing concrete analysis, or you're doing a psychological experiment, sometimes the discipline will invoke the language of science. But in the social science, typically where we don't have access to things like laboratory settings, we don't normally use science as a general idea, because we are not in a scientific setting. Any questions about the assignment? You've now had a couple of weeks to kind of stew over it, and do you guys have any questions about moving out of that into the next phase of work? Any questions at all? Okay. All right, the census. Back. Is this the way you like the room? How are we doing? Okay, so we have 5 minutes. So plan for the day is to talk about the census and give you a sense of what's in this this big data set that comes out every 5 years that's used for lots and lots of things. I also want to talk about monetary comparisons in the census. In the second hour, Lilia will be doing a talk on indicators, and then next week we'll be getting into hypothesis testing and quasi-experimental design. So in the methodology, in the assignment 1, I ask you to be really assertive about your hypotheses. If you have a hypothesis, state it. We're going to formalize that idea in next week. So we're going to be taking the idea of how do we set up a hypothesis? What does it look like? And what are we doing once we have a hypothesis? So that's where we're going to be next week. That's another thing I wanted to say about the assignment 1s. We've given, so we've used quite a range of marks for assignment 1, and some people are getting really great marks, like 89, 92. And we've also awarded a few down in the low 50s at this point. The range might get bigger or smaller, it's hard to say. Or not smaller, probably, but bigger. But the other thing I wanted to say about the assignments is that even if you come up with 100% on this assignment, I want you to remember that that is not necessarily an indication that you will get 100% on the final assignment. And the reason is we're evaluating you at week 5. Week 5, you didn't know what was in the census, right? You didn't know how to really set up a hypothesis and think about testing it in a structured way and representing that visually. next week you're going to know how to do that, or you're going to have a better sense of it. So we do expect that all of this is going to find its way into your writing. So it's not necessarily to say that you can just take what you submitted a couple of weeks ago and start writing toward the end of it, and add more things, and it's going to work out to the same percentage, the 89 that you got on the first submission. Because we are considering that you don't have the structure yet to do things like state which hypothesis you're going to test. So we are sort of considering both of those. So just be aware when you do get your mark that you're going to want to be continuing to improve the content with the new material that comes. The problem is humans are linear. That's our problem. We have to learn things kind of one at a time, but then we have to understand them and implement them in this holistic way. And that's why writing is hard, because we have things in our minds that we understand or want to express, and then we have to put them into in a linear timeline, one word and one letter at a time. And it's hard. That's why some writing is really hard to read, like Heidegger is really hard to read, because he's wrestling with this idea of infinite space and trying to make it in linear so we can read it as humans. And then when it goes into the brain, it gets all mushed up again, and we don't understand it linearly anymore, like we wrote it, which is weird, but that's how our minds work. Wittgenstein kind of described that as you climb up the tower, and then you pull the rope up behind you, and there's no way someone else can come up the same rope. They have to have their own rope, and there's no way back for you, because you can't unknow things either. Except sometimes I do forget things that I thought I knew, which is disconcerting, but anyway. All right, the census. Oh, tutorials. We did that. Another matter of administration is next week we're going to there's a chance for 3 people in every tutorial to get feedback on your quantitative indicators. So it's just a quick half-page write-up of what you think you're going to do for if you're doing a quantitative study. There's an opportunity later in the semester for qualitative feedback as well. So we'll workshop those as a group. So if you'll have time today in your tutorial to volunteer with your tutor. If it's not 1 page, that's okay. If it's half a page, if it's seriously just a list of indicators, that's fine too. But consider it, and remember the fear of public speaking is Okay, so the other thing is peer review groups. So we've got this peer review assignment. Coming up, we're going to be describing, and not next week, but the week after, how to do a peer review and how to review the work of other people and how this whole peer review thing works. But you do have the framework for peer review in the subject guide. If you are allocated to a 2-person group, so your peer review groups occur in your tutorial. And the benefit of that is that you get to go and be with those people who you probably know them from your tut, or you'll have an easy chance to meet up with that person. The bad part of it is that some tutorials have the wrong number of people to put you into a 3-person group and have none left at the end. So the result has been that some 2-person groups have been formed in tutorials. If you end up in a 2-person group, you have 2 options. Number 1, you can only work with the 2-person group. So that means you will provide 1 peer review, and you will receive 1 peer review. And you'll be marked entirely on the 1 peer review that you give and the one that you receive. The other option is to combine with another 2-person group, but those will be in a different tutorial, and you're going to have to find them. So the list is up on the LMS. Have to email those people. If you combine a 2-person group with a 2-person group, you get 4 people. The normal peer review group size is only 3 people. So you do not have to do 3 peer reviews in that case. You only still have to do 2. So you need to work out within your group so that everybody gets two peer reviews, how you're going to do that. So you have some options, but it's just the way the numbers have worked out. In past, we have done peer review groups holistically through the class rather than by tutorial, and people don't like that either. So it's always something people don't like. So this year we're trying this way. We'll see how it goes, and then maybe adjust next year, but that won't help you at all. Unless you're a tutor, that might help you then. So any questions about peer review groups or volunteering for next week? All right. Yay. Okay, so the census is this great data set that we get that has all kinds of limitations and issues and problems, and also is really powerful and excellent and interesting. But we use in community and urban work, or lots and lots of demographic situations, we use the census to try to understand a place, try to understand the characteristics of people situated in space. So the census can inform a narrative. So I've had students do work on gentrification in Hume, asking the question, is that happening? Is gentrification happening? Will auto manufacturing pullouts change the demographics of Hume? Now that's a bit of a hypothetical question, but it does not can, right? It's will. And the reason it's different is because they were doing a projection kind of analysis based on the likely change in demographics after the auto industry closed. Are there enough schools in the Docklands? Is my community a food desert? Is housing affordable in my community? Would new language programs targeted at new migrants be useful in interface council areas, so the places at the end of the metropolitan area? Where are there affordable housing development opportunities? So where is and there's a certain structure of that kind of question. An indicator for that. How have activity center policies produced jobs housing balance? It's a study that I did. The census gives us access to data that can help us to understand a lot of these questions and many, many more. So we're going to talk today about using the census data. So how it's organized, what's in it, what we do with the data that's in it, because it's not like a great old survey where we have individual record data, and how we deal with population, households, and housing. And all of the census data is available at the ABS website, abs.gov.au, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So the census is a census because it's 100% sample. So if you hear people say the sample, they are probably not talking about a census. When you get to the end of the intro period of the semester and the census period occurs, that's the period at which we have 100% sample of students who are enrolling classes. A census is any 100% sample, not just the census of population and housing, which occurs in most countries every 5 to 10 years, but any census, any 100% sample can be called a census. Our census products do have some other data sets that are drawn from the main census data set. One of them is called the census sample file, the CSF. And there are two samples, a 1% sample and a 5% sample, which is either available now or available very soon. And they are individual records. So they instead of what we're going to see is the census data is reported geographically in summary form for a geography, a suburb, an SA2. But there are some census products where you can get individual records. So one household or one census respondent gets a line in the data set. Unfortunately, you can't know who they are. They are anonymized. And there's some precision that's lost when they anonymize it, but it is a census product that's available. So the Census Data Enhancement project was the project that produced that 5% sample. In Australia, the census goes back to 1981, the modern version of the census. It was a bit more irregular before that. But the 5% sample only became available after the out of the 2011 census data. It became available in 2012. So we can't go back much further, any further than 2011 with this 5% sample. But this is a great product because it tracks individuals over time. So it's not just a sample of, a random sample from 2011 and then another random sample from 2016. It is Rob in 2011 and Rob in 2016. We don't know it's Rob. He's anonymized. But it is a very powerful product. It's available for approved projects. So you can't just go into the table builder like we're going to do today and get this product. You have to apply for it. But you're part of the university. If you want this data set, it would be available to you. We could work out how to get you approval. So the census is organized into what we call geographies, which are basically spatial units in which the data is reported. And this is the 2006 data. So what happens is, enumerators go around and they collect your data from your household, and they accumulate it, they aggregate it into the census then puts it all together, and they aggregate it first into mesh blocks in 2006. That's what they did. And then collection districts. In 2006, those collection districts formed the basis of all the other geographies. They were built from them. So suburbs were built from collection districts, indigenous locations, urban centers, statistical local areas. And there's this kind of big mess of census geographies in the old geographies. In 2011, the Census Bureau decided that it was going to make the census geographies more concordant with each other. So it was going to, instead of having all these different things built up, they were going to have ones that agglomerated upwards in a hierarchical way. So we have, we'll call them statistical area level 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, all up to Australia. So we start at the mesh block, same as before, but instead of have some mesh blocks being aggregated in some ways to SLAs and others being aggregated to suburbs, now it's all these SA 1, 2s, 3s, and 4s are all buildable from each other. So in some ways that's really nice. SA 1s, there are about 54,000 of them at that lowest level. SA 2s can be whole suburbs or combinations of suburbs. So that's 54,000 in Australia. SA 3s have 30 to 130,000 people, depending on where you are. SA 4s have about 100,000 plus people. And there are other geographies. So our mesh blocks go up to SA 1s and then SA 2s, but they can also be aggregated to local government areas. So if you're interested in a local government's experience instead of an SA 1, or you want to aggregate to a postal code or a state suburb or a commonwealth, an electoral division, you can do that from the SA 1 data now. You could not do that in 2006. So they have done this great job of changing the geographies, and this is the basic alignment we get. The collection district is something like the statistical area level 1, but not the same. They don't have the same boundaries. The statistical local area from 2006 is something like the SA2, but they're not the same with the same boundaries. So if you want to compare 2006 and 2011, you can't just go and find SA1s on one hand and collection districts on the other, usually, if you're worried about the data representing the same place. If the boundary shifts a little, you have no idea whether the change is because you got the place changed or because you got a new area that was different included or part of your area got lopped off. So it's a frustrating change, but the hierarchy is supposed to be for the best. So what do these geographies look like? Well, we have all of Australia and then the states inside of it. Those of you who, I always forget, is it 7 states and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states and territories in Australia? I had to take a test for my citizenship where they asked me that. But I spent much more time memorizing that Donald Bradman was a cricketer and didn't get asked that. We have statistical divisions. So there are, you can see the Northern Territory, for instance, is this monstrosity right here, and it's one statistical division, very low population. So they are scaled according to how dense the population is. You can see around Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne, they get more dense over around Perth. We have state statistical divisions. Those are the ones in Victoria. We have statistical local areas. Up to 2011, we had those. We no longer have statistical local areas. We only have those SA1s and SA2s. We have states and capital cities, suburbs, and 2006 and before, we have collection districts. So this is a smaller part of Collingwood that sits between Smith and Wellington and Stanley and Peel, which is a collection district. And this is the mess that is the concordance between the 2006 and the 2011 data. So that reset that happened at 2011 will be great going forward, but we're not talking a little bit of difference. We're talking a lot of difference. So this will inform how you use the census data. And there are ways around this, but you have to think about them. These are SLAs versus SA2s. So another thing that has been frustrating for me is that the SLA, the statistical local area, was a census geography that was available all the way from 1981 to 2011. So they kept it even when they changed these census geographies. And in 2016, they dropped it. So we don't actually have a common unchanging geography, a census geography. Now, we do have suburbs and postcodes and that sort of thing, but even a lot of those have changed because some of the outer suburbs have grown or changed boundaries. Also, they're reasonably big areas, suburbs, so especially when you get out to the urban fringe. So this is the situation we're in at the moment. And inconsistent boundaries do have some consequences. So the project that I've raised about activity centers, up to that, we could analyze activity centers in Melbourne and the outcomes of activity center policies between 1981 and 2011 reasonably easily. That is time. All right. We could analyze, questions about, is the planning we're doing around activity centers, is the resourcing we're allocating to the planning of activity centers, is the way that activity centers are planned since 1981 to 2011, is that producing results that we would expect the policy to produce? So we could actually ask those questions. When we go to update the analysis for 2016, we find the SLA is gone. We do not have access to studying whether Plan Melbourne, which was released in 2014, has produced any change in the activity center policies. Now, if I were a state, when I say state, I mean government. I don't necessarily mean the state of Victoria. So as, if I were a state, I might be really pleased with that because nobody can complain about what I've done. There's no way to question, or there are fewer ways to question the decisions. As a citizen, I find that to be troubling. And I hope that one of you goes to work in the census and sorts some of this stuff out. We have to be aware that we can only manage to some degree what we measure. And so the state may have different incentives than we have. And there's a discussion to be had there which is bigger than this class. This paper is coming out pretty soon in a journal called Agenda, which is published out of ANU. And we are interested in whether these activity centers have produced metropolitan fabric that looks like a place that has vibrant activity centers looks. So we wanted to know whether, there's this metropolitan plan, actually a series of metropolitan plans, with Plan Melbourne being the most recent one. There's been an update of Plan Melbourne in 2016. But did this plan produce activity center-like behavior among commuters? And did businesses start behaving like there were activity centers around them? So we asked these questions. And we had this fantastic quasi-experimental design. So next week, we're going to talk about quasi-experimental design and what that means. Experimental design is what you do in medicine. You get the drugs, you don't. We're randomly assigned. We see how the effects are. Does this group get cured in a higher incidence, higher rate than this group? Yes, the drug works. No, it doesn't. That's a scientific approach. In the social sciences, we cannot do that because we cannot, for instance, if we want to analyze Melbourne, we can't just randomly assign parts of Melbourne into the plan and parts out. So we have to look at the whole strategy. But the great setup in Melbourne is that since 1981, there have been 4 plans, plus the 2016 plan. And there have been implementation periods. So the plan changes every few years, every 7 or 5 years, which is from an experimental or quasi-experimental strategy very nice, because it gives us a chance to observe what happens in the implementation period. And what we're looking for is one of 2 scenarios. So in a kind of scenario 1, there we have places that had been influenced by an activity center and places that were not influenced by an activity center. So 2 different groups, right? In some ways, the treatment group and the control group. The group that got the drug and the group that didn't get the drug. Now, 2 things could happen to those groups. Nothing. They could continue along in a reasonably even, steady way without changing in response to the policies. So this is time, 1981, 1986. Or when you get to the policy time, when the policy changes, one of the groups could change. So what we would expect if the policy were a success is that the places that had exposure in some way to activity centers would change differently than the places without activity centers. Now, there are lots of ways these lines could go. One could go up, one could go down. They could both track up, but not quite as quickly. This is just a very stylized example. But this is essentially how we'll know whether we have policy success. Did the policy or the set of policies change something about the way that the metropolitan area is behaving? And the other great thing that makes this a great quasi-experimental design is that the policies were not rolled out evenly. This is a statistician's dream. So some places, like Sunshine, were designated to be, now these are a particular kind of activity center called a national employment cluster. There were dozens, sometimes hundreds of activity centers in different plan periods. But just looking at this group of 6, Sunshine got designated right away in 1981, in the 1981 plan. The others didn't. Then Latrobe, Sunshine, and East Werribee got designated, and Monash. And then finally, as you move over time, Parkville joins those and others. But that gives us the chance to see whether, in this period, Sunshine behaved differently than its peers that did not get some sort of activity center exposure. And this gives us the chance to observe whether Dandenong South, when it became in the influence of a named activity center, did it change differently than its peers that were not named? So we get that, well, actually it's the other way around, Monash, East Werribee, et cetera. So this gives us a chance to rule out other explanations, like it was something about the economy in the 80s, which is a really fair possibility because the economy did weird things in the 80s. So it's possible, if we do not establish a control group, that it was the national or international economic situation that changed the urban dynamics and not the policy. So we're always looking for ways to try to test whether it was the policy rather than the big economic situation. And one way we can do that is to look for places that did not receive the same treatment at the same time. So if every time a new suburb gets an activity center designation and it starts to change in response to that, we have a policy effect rather than a national economic effect. It has to change relative to the other. So we're going to talk about all this next week. The quasi-experimental design is a little bit tricky. When we wanted to do this analysis of Melbourne's activity center policies, we also ran into this problem that every policy calls activity centers different things. And so we had to find a way to align them by reviewing the policy and deciding, okay, Central City, that's pretty straightforward one. What does a district center in the 1981 policy align with a major mixed use center in the 1995 policy? So we had to impose this structure and order on the data, which were basically just some government plans, some documents that came from whatever state government organization implemented the policy at the time, which also changed. So we had this responsibility to do this and make these judgments, and we had to justify our choices. So 1981, these are national employment clusters only, in Sunshine, 95, 2002, and 2014. So we have this proliferation of activity centers. And in fact, this is 1981, 95, and 2002. We don't have the 2014 data in here because it didn't actually make it into the final cut of the paper for various reasons. But what you can see is the influence, the number of activity centers has grown over time. So it's gotten popular. We like being an activity center. Activity centers are nice. The metropolitan area is getting bigger. There are more people. We need more activity centers. More commitment to activity centers in some way. So, and if you think about it, that means that more of the metropolitan area is covered by the influence area, whatever that means, you have to define that, of an activity center. In 2002 versus 1981, there's less of the area visible from out behind the activity centers. So our indicator was how much of an SLA is covered by an activity center. 60%, 20%, 15%. And you may say, Jenny, some of those activity centers overlap. You're right. So we had to deal with that as well and decide how we were going to do it. We decided to count the overlap. So if there were overlapping segments, the activity center could have 120% coverage. And we ran what's called a sensitivity analysis. So we looked at various possibilities for the size of the influence. Because an activity center in the plans, which is very frustrating, they don't say, oh, it's this road and this road and this road and this road, that's the activity center. What they say is, it's in the middle, they say Hawthorne or Fitzroy, and so what is that? What does that mean? So we had to decide what the influence area was, and we scaled those based on the kind of activity center they were. If they were a neighborhood activity center, they got a bigger geographic reach. If they were a smaller geographic reach, if they were a neighborhood activity center, bigger areas got, it's like national activity centers got a bigger reach. And this is a little beyond the scope of the subject, but basically what we found was nothing. So a failure case. We did the analysis and we found that the activity, so our indicator was jobs housing balance. How much people were living where they work and working where they live based on the census data. And we found that it didn't matter. The data suggests that the activity center policies had no effect. So that, went down to the VPA, the Victorian Planning Authority, and told them about it, and they said, yes, that's absolutely right, we expected that, but we're doing it better. But you and I have no way to test that going forward. So it's a little bit frustrating. Maybe in a few years, in a few censuses, we'll have enough data to build up a testing platform again. But for now, we're dealing with only 2 waves of data. So it's a bit frustrating. We developed other workarounds. So if you're a person who's interested in doing this kind of testing, we've also developed the process to chop those SLAs into smaller areas and downward project the jobs data into smaller polygons. But it's a projective process. So we basically said, okay, this place has 50 medical jobs, 250 medical jobs. They're probably all in the hospital. So and if there are 34 retail jobs, they're probably in the commercial zone. We know that that's not necessarily true, so there are problems with projections downward. But if you're interested in trying to work around the census data and the way that it's formatted, there are processes that are available. This is one of the analyses we ran about auto parts manufacturing, looking for clusters of certain kinds of auto parts manufacturing based on some of those downward projected polygons. So a bit outside the scope of the subject, but I just wanted to give you the chance, if you're interested in small areas, and comparing over time, that there are some options available. So in the census, some geographies have been reasonably constant. The SLA was a bridge to the other years of the census, up to and including 2011, and also bridges to other data sets, like health data sets, are often, they were reported in SLAs. So I'm not sure now what data sets, how health data sets, for instance, are being reported. I suspect it's SA2s. SA1 and SA2, so you have the data between 2011 and 2016, but you can't go backwards before that. LJs and suburbs, but they do change, especially if they're at the urban edge and they're expanding. States that's been constant, but they're really big, don't really help us. Oops. Sorry, that's... Wow. I put the wrong slides into this. Anyway, it's fine. Skip this. This does not apply to this. I have apparently surgically inserted some extra slides into here that are not even relevant to the class. Sorry about that. You can skip this slide when you're reviewing it. And this one too. Okay. So when we get into the tutorial, we're going to be looking at census geographies. Now, this is an example of a 2016 census geography, and you can kind of see it's between Donald and Mitchell, and it goes over almost to Holmes, and I don't know, about halfway to Sydney Road, that direction, if you're familiar with the Brunswick area. And this is 2011, same geography. But the 2006 geography in the same general area is, well, this isn't the same area, but what I wanted to point out was the numbering changes. It doesn't have the same numbering. This is a collection district in 2006. And this is the closest geography to those other two. So this is a 2006 geography that's closest to these, but it kind of goes further over and not as high. So they're changing a lot, the geographies between censuses. So I want to stop there. We didn't get to finish the lecture on the census data, but we do have a break. We'll have a break, and then we'll have a discussion of indicators. And then when we pick up next week, the first thing we'll do is finish a discussion about how the census is collected and organized. So what I just want to leave you with before you go is that the census has 4 overlapping universes. So there are 4, oops, bigger is good. There are 4 major bodies of work that all sit, major bodies of indicators that all sit in the census. So we have our population, we have individuals. We have individual people who are counted. Those individual people form households. So the census also reports data on households. It reports data on housing units, whether they're occupied or not. And it reports data on the labor force, where people work, what they do, and typically where they live. So the census has data on individuals, on households, on housing units, and on labor force. Now, obviously, individuals work, and individuals live in households, and households live in housing units. So these data sources from the census, or these universes in the census, all overlap, and they're all interrelated. But one thing for your indicators that you might be wanting to think about is, which one am I interested in? Am I interested in a household, or am I interested in an individual? There are different census indicators that will give you access to those different levels of data. Or maybe it's just, for me, really about the housing units. I'm really only interested in apartments versus freestanding houses. It's a different indicator. The census gives you a whole bunch of this. So next week we'll talk about some of the indicators that you can construct from the census data, and we'll also talk about monetary values. But first, shall we take a, what time is it? 56. Shall we take an 8-minute break? Come back at 5 after? Is anybody interested in a muffin? We got this sorry muffin from the cafe because they got our coffee order wrong. So they gave us muffins. None of us wanted it. So there's a muffin. Yeah? Excellent. Thank you. Run by muffining. Hey. Who knows how to do that?
And I have a class just before, so I'm MSD
215. So, okay, it's next door.
It's no, because they're in the other building. They're in John Medley. They're in John Medley WGO5. So they're already that
139.
139.
Okay, I'll tell them.
At 2:15.
I don't even know how to do that. How do you do that? Standing. Oh, could we? But still, I work here.
I work here for psych, but I do all the room bookings over at psych school. So.
I'm coming to you next time. I have a problem.
What is the free USB?
This thing.
And go ahead for the thing.
That's it. Yeah.
How do you mute it?
It's muted now. So that's the toggle. And you have to turn it on there.
And then it's not muted.
Yeah. When you turn it on, it'll still be muted. You have to unmute it on the top.
Do I have to wear this?
You can or you cannot. If you're going to stand here, this thing is a microphone too. Okay. So you don't have to wear it.
So
For it to capture
that should be on me.
You can, yeah. That's annoying.
This week is fine, I think, because it's another room, but I'm not sure. I think I'm not going to check.
What do you, so MSD 139 and 215.
I already sent out.
Got it. It's not 138, 139. Just look at the online schedule. So I'll check with Nazar. Sorry about that.
Jenny, how can I access my user?
Oh, are you using, that no name thing should be it.
Ah, okay. And how could I move through this? Just this button?
Yeah, if you hit that little jobby there, that'll move it to full screen. And then you just click through like that. Yeah.
Okay, you don't have the flicker.
I've never seen one in this room.
It's okay, so I have to carry this with me, yeah?
Yeah. You can put it on your pants. Put it in your pocket. Where you look.
so I was not sure what would be the best way.
Yeah. Yeah. You can turn one of the off.
So, but will it be equally visible?
Yeah, not really equally. It depends on how big you write. Interesting. Yeah, I was just trying to help, but something
What do
you've
you
got.
think is a good idea?
Yeah, put it in there.
Okay, test. The mic is on. Shall we start? For those who do not know me, I'm a tutor for this course. I run two tutorials. So in the second half of this lecture, I'll talk about indicators and indices. And I will refer to my PhD thesis because it was a quantitative and I used many of the indicators. So what's the program for today? I will start by introducing my thesis. And I will concentrate just on one chapter due to time limitations and the limit of this lecture. Then we will talk about what are indicators and indices. And again, I will draw examples from my thesis. Then briefly review the methods which I used. After that, we will talk about what makes indicator good indicators. So that would be about reliability and validity of the indicator. And at the end, I will discuss the results of that chapter of my thesis, because obviously it would be too long if I talk about the whole thesis. So these were research questions of my PhD thesis. Okay, well, the fourth question is here. So in brief, my thesis looked at the financial behavior of immigrants, whether or not this behavior is different from financial behavior of people who were born here, and then how it was affected by both immigrants' home country characteristics and by Australian immigration policy. And I also looked at the well-being of immigrants. So more specifically, I look at three aspects of the financial behavior, which is financial risk-taking, saving, and remittances. In addition, I looked at the well-being of Australian immigrants, and because my thesis was about financial aspects of their behavior, I concentrated on the financial well-being. So of course, it was a big project, and it took me 4 years to complete. So today I will briefly talk about just one chapter, which is about saving behavior. And I will also draw some examples from another chapter, the last chapter on well-being. The reason why I selected these two, and mostly the first one, because I produced papers based on these chapters. And obviously, it took me much longer time, much more time to work on this, and I put a lot more thought into this. So because when you publish, you send and you have to make many amendments. So I would say this would be the better quality than the other ones. So the first paper, as I said, looks at the saving rates of immigrants and compares it to the native-born Australians, and if they found to be different, then I looked at the reasons why they were different. And one of the reasons which I wanted to look at, the connection which I want to look at, is whether or not these differences in savings could be related to their regions, to their home countries. So whether or not the immigrants from different countries save less because of something that is different, was different in their background. And that the last chapter is about well-being. Again, I compared well-being of immigrants and well-being of native-born Australians, and by well-being, in simple terms, means whether or not they're as happy as people who were born here. And if I found that this is it, and that was it, why? And again, I looked at, I thought maybe whether the financial well-being could be the reason, or maybe something in their countries of origin, their background could contribute to their happiness here. And this is the link to the papers. So this was a quantitative study, and I used 2 longitudinal data sets. HILDA, which is Household Income and Labor Dynamics in Australia, and LSIA. As I said, they're both longitudinal studies. It means they follow over the time same individuals. I would say HILDA is bigger than LSIA. LSIA is just 3 waves of data. And HILDA currently, I think, has 13 or 16. And at the time when I was doing my thesis, it had 7 waves of data. I limited the population to adults, which I defined as individuals aged 15 and over. Yeah. So, and I selected just a couple of periods, because the reason why I selected 2002 and 2006 and HILDA, because not all of the waves had the data what I needed. And I needed data on the wealth, for example. Questions on wealth were asked only in 2002 and 2006. Okay, so what's an indicator? That's something that defines a concept, something which is not so easy to quantify. For example, if we are interested in the change of income of Australian residents between period A and period B, we can use census data, yeah? Income is available in census data. But for example, neighborhood is not so easy. The status is not so easy to create an indicator for the status. So one of the indicators could be the neighborhood where people live. So if people live in Turak, for example, they probably be considered much better off, whereas compared to people who live maybe in the outer suburbs. Yeah? GDP also used as a measure of nation's wealth. But some terms are not so easy to quantify. For example, what about safety of the particular area? Just food for thought. What indicators would you use? Yeah, that would be one indicator. Yeah, house prices. Yeah, so that could be used as an indicator. So of course, you have to justify that that was used previously in the paper and why you would think there would be good indicators. You can also use income, for example, but you have to put an assumption that people who are better off, they're probably less prone to commit any crime. Yeah. So, and also, for example, like in my paper, it was not easy to find an indicator for happiness. So it's not so straightforward. And what I did, I used a multidimensional indicator. So I used a few indicators. The first one, the first one was I assume the happiness is same as life satisfaction. And that was it's not that I just came up with that idea. It used interchangeably in quite a few papers. So that was my approach. So I assume that happiness and life satisfaction are the same. And in Hilda, luckily they have a variable which measured life satisfaction on a scale from 0 to 10. So on a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate your satisfaction with the life? And people had to give a number. In LSIE, they also have, but it was on a scale from 1 to 5. So that was my first indicator. Sorry, it's actually not an indicator, it's index. So that brings up to the what is called index. Index is quite similar to indicator, and sometimes it's used interchangeably, like what I did just now. It's is a scaled or normalized indicator. For example, life satisfaction. Yeah, so you rate something from 0 to 10. Or if you look at the consumer price index, it's a weighted sum of prices. So it's scaled. So it will be 101 basic year, and then it will be all that index will be all compared to that base year. GDP per capita. So you take GDP and divide by population size. Or poverty line. Poverty line is also sometimes called poverty threshold. This is the smallest amount of money a person or a family needs to live on. Yeah. So suppose this is the income. So that's not that's the proportion of the population who earns this kind of income. Suppose this is the income of the whole population. And YI is the income which is called the threshold. So if people earn YI or less, then they will be considered poor. So if PI is a proportion of population who earns this income or less, then 1 minus PI would be the proportion of people who earns income higher than this. So that would be PI, and this would be 1. This is the total population. So that would be the proportion of people, so-called poor people, and this is a proportion of people who are not poor. Yeah. Well, it's not so important, but maybe for some of you it would be easy to understand. It's easier for me when I look at the graph to understand something, the concept. And okay. As I said, life satisfaction was also index because it's ranking. It's was based on using Likert scale. Likert scale is when a respondent is asked to evaluate something by giving it a quantitative value. And the most common is, I think that would be better. The most common is a 5-level Likert item, such as strongly disagree, to strongly agree. So there would be 5 of them. In between will be disagree, neither agree or disagree, and agree. Yeah, so that would be example of Likert scale. Okay, so now coming to my research and the indicators and indices that I used. As I said, I used measurement of life satisfaction. This is an example of index because it asks respondents to evaluate their own feelings on a scale from 0 to 10 or 1 to 5. In Hilda, there was also financial well-being, which is same as financial satisfaction, and it measures the levels of individual satisfaction on a scale from 0 to 10. The financial satisfaction was one of the indicators that measures financial well-being. I also had a couple more. They are inability to pay bills, which was equal to 1 if respondent answered yes to any of the 7 questions, reflecting their ability to pay. That include payment for electricity, heating, and whether they ask for financial help. So if they answered yes to at least one of these questions, then the inability to pay bills will be 1. And if not, it will be 0. And this is what is called dummy variable. The second one was Raising 2000. That was already available in Hilda. And it was a variable which had 4 values, 1 to 4. 1, you could easily raise 2000, and 4, you could not raise 2000. No, it just says in case of emergency. It's easily raise, could not raise. Yeah. Okay, so coming now to my chapter on savings. As I said, I wanted to analyze the household savings or saving behavior and compare the saving behavior of 2 groups of population, immigrants and Australians who were born here. I knew that I'm going to look at the saving behavior, but I needed to think about the indicator which I was going to use. Because I decided to use household as a unit, so the most obvious thing was to use the household saving rate. But deciding that I'm going to use household saving rate was not enough. I had to think about how I'm going to calculate that saving rate. And in the literature, I came across 2 approaches. The first is saving as the difference between income and expenses. And the second approach is the difference between wealth in 2 periods. The first one is quite easy to understand. Yeah, so you look at the whole income less expenses. Second one probably is not so straightforward. What they did in the papers is they look at the wealth, current wealth, and some wealth in the future, which was mostly estimated. And then they took the difference. So I looked at the second approach as well, because here they had data on wealth, and it didn't give me any good results. And the reason I thought there are a few reasons why that could be the case. The first was that often when people assess their wealth, they include the value of their home, which is not a constant value. It keeps changing, and property values change. Then household tends to overestimate their wealth, so that could be another reason. And it also included some windfalls, such as the payments which we don't expect to receive. So all this probably was the reason why I did not get good results, and why that's how I justified why I'm using the first approach. So Hilda had data on household income and household expenses, which was good. And so I selected the first one. And so that it was the saving, and the saving rate is the same divided by income. And I used two models to answer my research questions. The first one was actually looking at whether or not the saving rates are different between immigrants and Australia-born, and the second one looked at what could affect that saving rate. And I looked, in both of them, I used household characteristics such as income, wealth, gender, the characteristic that could potentially affect how much they save. And in the first one, where I tested whether or not there are difference, I used a dummy variable called born in Australia. Which was equal to 1 if person born in Australia. And 0 otherwise. Yeah. So if that it had a significant coefficient, then I assumed that the savings were different between Australia-born and native-born Australians. And then I looked after that, and I looked at the immigrant-only sample, where I looked at I also used household characteristics, but I also added the country of origin characteristics, which include GDP, national saving rate, etc. So both models were estimated by using two-stage least squares, which is, I'm not going to go too deep into this because it's far out of the scope of this subject. Do I have to give a break to people?
No, second hour. Good.
Yeah.
Do we need a break?
If you have questions, just raise a hand. Then that would be break. Okay, something simple, just an exercise. As I said, I was going to use the GDP as one of the indicator of immigrants' origin, and to be precise, I included GDP per capita. So GDP is, or gross domestic product, is a measure of the economic output of a country, and often it's used as an indicator of country's development. So to calculate it, we add the market prices of all the goods and services produced in the country at a given time period. So in a simplified economy like this, where we assume that there are only two products produced, bananas and bankrupts, what would be GDP in this period, for example? If you look at the bananas, two products, bananas, bankrupts. How much do you get if you sell all bananas? Third period. You get third period. If they're $2 per kilo or per banana, how much do you get if you sell all of them? Sorry? Yeah, 20. 2 times 10. And if you sell all of the bankrupts, 54, yes. 6 times 9, yeah? So that would give us 74. So in a simplified economy, that would be the GDP in the third year. Of course, in reality, it's not so simple. That would be the GDP of a country. So when you calculate GDP, you have to add consumer spending, investment, government spending, net export. What is net export? Do you know? That's export minus import. Yeah, in the simple words. The difference between spending on domestic goods by foreigners and spending on foreign goods by domestic residents, yeah, which is export minus import. So that's how would you calculate GDP of a country. Okay, so coming to the most important, most interesting part. As I said, I've used a few indicators for immigrants' country of origin, including GDP per capita. And what I had initially is GDP dependency rate. Do you know what's dependency rate of a country? No? Okay, so dependency rate is an age population ratio of those typically not in the labor force to the labor force, typically in the labor force. So general dependency rate would be the population aged 0 to 14, children, and 65 plus. And that would be divided by the population who is considered to be labor force, which are people aged 15 to 64. So I used this criteria. Then I split this into two, which is young dependent population and old dependent population, which is I look at the young people, the proportion of young people to labor force, and old, which is a proportion of people who is older than 65 to labor force. So that's what I used, and I also used national saving rate. And that's what was in my thesis. And this is what I submitted to the paper. And one of the reviewers who looked at this, maybe I should switch off the second. How do I do it? Screen.
Oh, there on the panel, there's, just click on.
Left projector.
Try it.
Yep. So when I sent the paper to the journal, it came back that it needs major work, major revision. Why? One of the reasons is that one of the reviewers said that it's not necessary that if I use national saving rate, it's not necessary should represent the household saving behavior at their home countries. And there could be few reasons for that. First is that we don't expect that migrant communities in Australia to be a representative sample of the home country population. That would be some of my results. For example, most what he or she said, that, for example, most South African immigrants in Australia are well-educated professionals. And that would explain why they would have high saving rate in Australia, which is 33.88, and compared to their country, national saving rate, which is 15%. Or the other reason is that national savings rate of any country, they don't just include household savings. They also include surplus deficit of the public sector and earnings of the corporate sector. So when there are changes in the economy, that will also affect the national saving rate. So that could be another reason why it would not be probably a very good indicator of household savings. And it will vary if the macroeconomy, there will be changes in the macroeconomy. And that's what he said could probably explain why there's a high national saving rate of China compared to very low rate in Australia, because China is shown as having a because China's public sector is huge, so that could probably be the reason of why the national saving rate is 53%. Whereas that's what he said or she said, that the low saving rate in Australia could be explained by the fact that probably there are students, mostly students here, who don't save as much. So he recommended that I find another indicator, or something close to household savings rate in the immigrants' country of origin. And this brings us to the subject of reliability and validity. What he said is that my indicator is not valid because it doesn't actually measure what it's supposed to measure. So, and when we think that the indicator is not valid, then we have to do something about it. Maybe find another indicator or just do something about the data. So there is another criteria of a good indicator, which is called reliability. That is a degree to which you can actually replicate the results. So to correct for this, in addition to these characteristics which I had before, I included national household saving rate, which was apparently available, and I didn't know that. It was United Nations statistics data. Plus, I included the average national rate. I included this one, saving rate, to account for the changes in fluctuations in the saving rate. And to my great joy, when I included all this and I ran the regressions again, I received similar results. So it means it was not that bad. And these are my results. So if you remember, I used two models. The first model was about finding whether or not the savings of immigrants and Australians born here were different, saving rates. And I found, yes, they were different. And what showed this is that the first variable, which is born in Australia, it had I don't know if you can see that. It had a positive and significant coefficient, which is 0.0389 and many zeros. And it had 3 stars, which means it was significant. How would you interpret this in a regression? Well, normally, regression coefficients show the mean change in the response variable for one unit change in that variable. For example, if you change, these are dependent variable. So if you change that variable, then how much dependent variable will change. So one unit change in independent variables. If you change the independent variables, how much the dependent variable will change. Yeah. But because this is a dummy variable, it will be equal to 1 if the person was born in Australia and 0 otherwise. If it's equal to 1, then it means that the saving rate will be by 0.389 higher than the saving rate of a person who was born in Australia. So So 4% higher. It means that people who were born here, saving rate of people who were born here is 4% higher than saving rate of people who were born overseas. So then I ran the second model, where I tested the effect of these characteristics on the savings of immigrants. And what I found is that national household saving rate, and national saving rate, they all had negative correlation with the savings in Australia. Whereas GDP had a positive coefficient. And dependency rate also positive. And these two did not have any effect. So once you get the results, you have to explain your finding. It's not just you just present the results. And I explain it, I'll attempt to explain it in the following. The positive relationship of GDP with the household savings in Australia could be explained by if a person comes from a wealthy country, he is supposedly well off, so he brings some wealth with him or her. And that he probably reinvested here and he gets additional income, so his savings will be higher here. The positive relationship with the age dependency ratio could be explained by so-called foresight motive of the household, which means that household save to pay for the expenses of the future. What does it mean? That if you have a higher percentage of aged population, and I'm talking about this only this came significant. Yeah. So if we talk about high percentage of aged population, it means that you have to save more for your future. Yeah? So interestingly, the other dependency ratios, like general dependency ratio and young dependency ratio, did not affect the savings. So it means that the high savings are particularly encouraged in countries that have aging population. And the most important result of this paper was that there was a negative correlation of household savings in Australia and the savings rate in their home countries. So I explained that my possible explanation was that immigrants either change their saving habits once they migrate here, or there's a lack of information on the remittances if you don't know what are remittances, is that these are the payments which you send home to help. And the reason why they could change their saving behavior is that, first, because of high level of Australian social security. For example, if you live in a country with low social security, then you have to save a lot. But when you move here, you get paid pensions, unemployment benefits, and other payments like sick leave. So that probably gives them incentive to save less. Also, another reason suggested in the literature that in Australia there is relatively high income tax compared to consumption tax. So that encourage spending and discourage savings. And because I used the savings in my paper were defined this way, which is this is the income and this is expenses. Unfortunately, in Hilda, data on remittance is not collected. So when I calculate saving this way, it is quite possible that because remittances are not accounted for, they will be here in this difference. And that is why when you have higher saving rate here in Australia, it is quite possible that it includes the remittances which were sent overseas with the saving rate national saving rate being low. It means that they are not so well off, so they rely on these payments. That's just general assumption. But of course, I didn't have enough data, and it was just an assumption, and I suggested that would be a good thing to test in the future, whether or not it's true. And just coming back to reliability and validity, because I got this negative correlation with savings in Australia and savings back home, I also took a sample from Hilda. I divided the households by the countries where they came from, took the samples which had more or less relatively large numbers, not just 1, 2, or 3. I look at the ones I think that had more than 30 respondents. Then I calculated the average household saving rate in Australia, and then I compared with the country of origin saving rate. And if you see, there's a similar pattern. Like this rate tend to increase, and whereas the national saving rate decreases. So, for example, in China, they have the lowest saving rate here. So Chinese migrants have the lowest saving rate, whereas in their country of origin, they have the highest rate among this in this sample, like 53%. And United States, they have 36% household saving rate, and 14% is their national saving rate. So that's a negative correlation. And that was also one of the ways to prove that I used a reliable indicator. And this is it. So that's what I wanted to tell you. And just to refresh what we've done today is that first I briefly discussed what was my PhD thesis about. Then I looked at indicator and indices, their definitions, and I provided some example from my PhD study. And then I looked at the definition of we discussed what's the importance of selected valid and reliable indicator, and I presented results of the second chapter of my thesis or of my paper. Hope you learned something new today. Any questions? Yeah.
And the first model includes wealth and income, right?
This one?
Yeah, when we were watching we were revising the results.
Yeah.
We have the whether it was born or not born in Australia,
Yeah.
income and wealth.
Yeah.
Aren't they related? There is no linear correlation between it, and I don't. That doesn't create a conflict in the model.
Well, that's what the
income and wealth.
Yeah, that's what the reason why I use two-stageless squares. And you use two-stageless squares is that when you expect that there would be correlation between dependent variable and independent variable. Yeah. But yeah, income and wealth, they were different.
Yeah, but
Wealth did not include the income.
but there is a linear relation between the
Some people can be wealthy through like home ownership, but they don't have high income.
Using the model, if you have two variables that if there are linear relation between two variables, I'm not mistaken, there can be a problem there.
No, wealth doesn't include income.
Oh, okay.
It's different.
Yeah, no, I know that.
Yeah.
Might be a
Yeah, but because savings were potentially correlated with wealth, that is why I had to use two-stageless squares.
Okay.
So then you use some, I don't remember what was it.
Yeah,
You use a different, yeah.
And with savings and GDP in the second one, you use something similar?
Yeah, for all of them I use two-stageless squares.
It's a little outside the scope of the subject, but you're absolutely right. Wealth and savings are related in that if you have more wealth, you may be more able to save. If you save more, you might have more wealth, right? So those can cross-influence each other. What she's talking about is a statistical technique that allows you to sort out the directionality of those relationships, how much of it is contributing in one direction and the other. It's outside the scope of the subject, but it was important to, she's talking, her regression estimation had to incorporate that problem that you've identified, that these two indicators do, they may be representing different things, but they may influence each other.
No, he said income and wealth. He thought they may be the same, but yeah, in the way I calculated wealth does not include income.
Right, but over time, your income of 5 years ago might be the wealth of now.
Mm-hmm.
And so
There's a relation.
But you might get wealth from other places too. Yeah. So it's all kinds of problems in that life is not simple, and yet we try to make it S equals Y minus E, right? And so we try to make things very simple, but sometimes they're not that simple. So then we do fancy statistical things to account for the problems, to control for the problems.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah?
What's the difference between the national household saving rate and the average national saving rate?
The
National saving rate.
average national saving rate is the average of this rate for 3 years. I should have said it more specifically.
So the national saving rate would be the sum total of all savings in the country
For this
divided by
year, yeah.
the sum total of all earnings in the country?
Sort of, yes. Let me just go back to my notes.
Well, yeah. If the national household saving rate. Oh, are you saying it's divided by population?
Yeah,
So
so
it's
one
divided by
by
household.
housing and the other one by population. Well, if it's an average,
Yeah, so the national saving rate is a proportion of gross national savings from the gross income,
Yep.
gross national income. Whereas household saving rate. So we are talking about the income of household and the saving of household only. Whereas this include, as I said, some government. This include rate of some government surplus deficit of the public sector and earnings of the public sector. So whatever happens in the economy could affect the national saving rate, not just whatever households save.
Okay, so the national saving rate also includes like
Yeah.
governments having
Yeah.
savings.
Surplus deficit of the public sector and the retained earnings of the corporate sector.
Got it. So it's not just household savings.
Yeah, so that's why it was not a very good indicator to use just alone. So, and I don't remember now, but I think I used national saving rate for a particular year, which was kind of relevant. I can go back and find it out. But because there's a lot of fluctuation in the national saving rate, I was also advised to use the average national saving rate for 3 years. So I took national saving rates for the 3 years and took the average to kind of account for these changes in the savings over that period.
I really liked the story of, my reviewer came back and said, don't like your indicator. It's likely not a valid indicator. And you go back and you sort of look at it again and try to understand what the objection of the reviewer is and how, whether or not there's another indicator that could do a better job. That's a great story because it shows how focused on the indicators the reviewers are going to be if you're trying to publish work, for instance, and how much one number can derail the whole argument from being accepted by people who are judging it, which is why it's really important to pay a lot of attention to your indicators. So, I like that story. It's a great story.
Yeah, thanks. And achieving just good results just from running 1 or 2 regressions is not enough. So you have to kind of test it from this angle, from another angle as well. So to prove that these results are actually reliable and can be replicated as well. That's it.
All right. Thank you very much. This is a really interesting talk about you.
Thank you.
We decided that, thank you to I won't say who in the class works at the university and can look these things up. We decided that Peretz Q15 will meet at 1:39 because it's an open room. MSD 139. So if you're in the 215 tutorial, go to 139. I think you're right now scheduled to go to 138, but just go next door. If you get lost, I'm sure somebody will be there looking for you. It might even be the same room. I'm not sure. It might just be 2 sides of the same wall. All right, 215, 139. Thank you. Oh, that's really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
It's tough to explain regression results to people who haven't. Yeah, it's. But I think that there was a good mix of like the referring to what this means. So you did a good job of saying you're born. The effect was you're born outside of Australia. You're saving 4% less.
Hi Jenny, can I ask you a question? I was just thinking about assignment 1, and I know it's like mostly too late now, but when I was doing the structure, I included my hypothesis. Is that thinking too much though? Now I've realised I've never done